DL Cummings. Welcome to the show, man.
How's it going? Glad to be here.
Going well, man. Really glad we finally connected. I've been wanting to connect with you for some time, man. I grew up without a dad, and you are the Liberty dad. I really want to chat with you, man. I think
Awesome.
what you're doing is really cool. So why don't you introduce yourself to my audience and for those who don't know who you are and what you're about?
Sure. So I'm an old man. I'm 47, and but I have a 7-year-old, so he keeps me young. And before he was born in 2019. Right before he was born, I was like, I think I should start a podcast, and that was the I don't want to say the first of many bad decisions, because I seem to make a lot of them. I have over time, and I was thinking, what am I going to talk about? Like, I know I like politics, but what's the nature of my show going to be? And I said to myself, you're going to talk, you're going to be teaching your son, basically everything he knows, maybe between me and my wife. But in terms of the podcast, I was like, I'm going to be teaching him everything he knows. And so I kind of came up with this idea of like Liberty Dad. Like, I'll talk about liberty. I'll also be a dad. And what do I want? What do I mean by being a dad? And that's kind of evolved over time a little bit. But initially I was like, I want to be, I work from home for corporate America. So I'm basically a white collar guy, but I also go out in the yard and I do a lot of, significant amount of yard work. I enjoy woodworking. And I'm very familiar with, some trades and stuff like that. So there's a little bit of blue collar in there as well. And I've done some blue collar work in the past. So that's the nature of my logo. It's a saw blade with a tie inside of it. And the whole idea was, when my son, I was just kind of envisioning, like, what happens when my son goes off to college? Is he going to be one of those that comes home and is like, Dad, I know you taught me all about, libertarianism or whatever, but man, these communist ideas are great, And so I was like, I don't want to be afraid of that, but I also want to make sure that whatever relationship that we have, he would be comfortable talking to me about it. And so I kind of envisioned it like, we need to worry about tomorrow's conversation by the one that we have today. And so if I'm just this ruthless, like, shutting everything down, not listening to him, just, like, nope, that's bad, that's wrong, it's wrong, then it's not really going to warm him up later when he actually is confronting real ideas and then maybe starts to believe them. Like, is he really going to want to have a conversation with me? So, and it's not about me having all the answers. It's just more about keeping the line of communication open by how I engage with him. And so I was like, all right, let me try to do this podcast thing, and I'll try to present things, in a way where people find it interesting. People want to come back. Maybe they want to ask you a question about something. You just basically think of it in terms of, I want to have a conversation with this person next week. How do I make sure that that line of communication is open? So that's the gist of the show. It's evolved a little bit over time. Now I do Dad Talk on Fridays, and that consists of what I'll do is I'll either, if I can get a dad to come on the show, we'll talk about what is important to him as a dad. And that's it. No argument, no debate. Like, it doesn't matter whether I agree with him or not. Like, and I've had a few dads on that, had some position on things that I didn't quite agree with. But the point is to raise dad voices, because I feel like dads are undervalued in our society tremendously. And so I didn't want to be like what you might call the red pill guys out there who are like, oh, women are bad, and, all this crazy stuff that you see. I was like, the answer, I think, is just to lift men up and to show them that there are good men that they can use as an example and get ideas from. And they don't even have to be, some guy who's got a bazillion followers and, is making tons of money. It could just be a regular, everyday, average dad. And you might say, wow, that's really interesting. I would like to apply that to my family or to my life. And so I try to do that. When I don't have a dad, I talk about stuff from the perspective of a father, a husband, or a dad, or some variation. So I do that on Friday. And then the show is kind of morphing these days into shows that are a little bit heavy on research, because I'm really, really big on reading. And so, like, Mondays are my bill review day. I'll just go and read a bill or a court ruling, or an executive order, or any kind of edict from the government of any kind. I'll read it, and then I will just say, okay, based on how I understand things, here is my understanding of this and the implications, and why I would or would not support it. Because I believe that, and I think you might disagree with this, I think But I believe that one of the big problems in society is that we don't read enough, and we don't, um, everything is superficial in areas where it needs to be important. Like we talk about politics and we're having all these debates, and I see debates online all the time, and I'm like, you guys are just barely scratching the superficial surface here. And not that we all need to be philosophers per se or read, tons and tons of books, but if we're going to talk about a legislation, we should perhaps at least read the legislation and then say, okay, what do I think about it? What are some of the ramifications of this? And am I comfortable with those consequences? What are potential unintended consequences? So hopefully that hits all the nail, my little elevator pitch there.
No, that's great. Thank you. So, did you have a good dad growing up? Like, I
I
found that
did.
there's usually two categories of people like you. People that had amazing dads that are trying to replicate and sort of pay forward what they've learned, or people like me who had a terrible experience and who are, trying to, make up for something they didn't have.
Right. So I actually had I'm not going to say that. I don't want to say, I don't want this to come off negative, right? It's not what I mean. I didn't have anything super amazing where I would just tell a story and people would be like, wow, you had the greatest dad ever. However, I still had a great dad, right? We actually had a rocky relationship, probably in my teens, probably because I was extremely rebellious. In fact, I've always been rebellious, but I got really bad in my teens, and and so that made it a bit challenging. We were also a church going family at the time, and so my parents were heavily invested in their religious faith, and I'm being rebellious, so that makes the clash even more difficult, right? Also, he is not my biological father, although I don't really think of it that way. He met my mom when I was 3. I've never met my biological father. I don't know. I only know like a few stories about him, and most of them are not necessarily good. So I don't really know anything about him. But my father is, for all intents and purposes, he's dad. He's father, because I've never known anybody else. I can't remember anything else whatsoever. But so to answer your question, yeah, I had a pretty decent upbringing. No problems. The worst problem that I suffered was one that many people suffered. I got spanked a lot, right? Just regular standard spankings. I personally don't look back on that in the negative, even though I'm generally opposed to spanking these days. Just because for me, I look at it and I say, I think kids are very resilient. And I think there's a range for which parents can be maybe less than the best. And as long as you are still offering good things, there's some flexibility if you're doing things that maybe aren't the best, right? So like if you spank your kids and then you're there for them in their their biggest needs, their first breakup, or financial trouble, or you go into their ball games. I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people like me grow up and they're like, yeah, I got spanked all the time. I don't spank, but I really love my parents because I think they're great people, right? So it seems contradictory, I think, within the libertarian community, at least the way that we talk about spanking. So, that would be the worst that I would say that I grew up with, was just getting spanking. But it was just regular stuff. It wasn't like, horrendous or anything like that.
Yeah. There's clearly a sliding scale here, right? Like like when it comes to spanking, or let's call it corporal punishment. That's a better
Mhm.
way to put it.
Right.
And then I think it's there's a, as you mentioned, there's clearly a debate about it. And I'm not somebody who gets histrionic. I do believe that you're right, that some kids are, like a lot of kids are resilient to some degree. But I think that there's ample evidence that kids, that it depends on how the kid's born, constituted, right? Their genome, their epigenetic,
Right.
all those factors are taken into how that impacts a child. And I'm like you, I'm opposed to it. Like I think it's, no matter how you slice it, I think it's abuse. I don't think there's any way that you can say, hey, I'm going to hit my wife and it's not abuse, right? And but for
Right.
some reason, we have this sort of category for children where it's like, well, they're the only people in society that you can hit, and you happen to be 10 times larger than them and all the things,
Yeah.
right? But I
Well,
also,
5 times in my position, but yeah.
You get my point. Like you're essentially a giant, you know.
Yep.
It's not even like you can't hit somebody your own size without, you know, committing a crime.
Right.
But for some reason, children is okay. And so I'm like generally clearly opposed to that, but I also am not gonna like I'm not gonna start an argument with people and start shit.
Right.
Like, it's almost like the circumcision stuff. Like I'm clearly against that. I just did an episode with George from the Tin Men and Martha Bueno.
Mm-hmm.
I clearly land over here, but I don't shame people for certain things, and I don't you know, like to pick fights. I feel like sometimes it's unproductive to pick fights, you know. So I'm like kind of curious.
It's hard for me because I'm like I see Martha Bueno. I know she's really big on it, and I feel like it's too easy to almost feel like you're talking about somebody else's kid's junk. And I'm just
well,
like,
she got in trouble.
I don't want to have that conversation. You know what I mean?
She kind of got into trouble with Dave Smith about that, didn't she? If I remember
saw
correctly.
That, yeah, I understand what she was trying to do, but that's where I think because I want to say in good faith, I don't think she was trying to be, that inappropriate. But I think it's easy to lose sight of it when you're fighting a battle about a topic that you're really passionate about, and then you fail to pick your words wisely. And then so she was like, did you do this to your kid? It's like, yo, do you realize what you're asking? That's one of the reasons why I just stay away from that debate, because it's uncomfortable. I don't want to talk about that, and it's like,
completely. And I'm kind of like one of those people that I think that I want to have these discussions in a public forum in a generic sense, as opposed to, confronting people directly about it. And I have no shade. If people want to take a different approach, that's fine. I don't think I've got all the answers or I do things exactly the right way, but I think it becomes maybe counterproductive in a certain point. I think that the spanking, the circumcision thing, like if you get too, aggressive about it, you start to have the build psychological reactance, and people pull back and maybe even refortify their position because this guy's an asshole. Like I'm completely justified in maintaining my beliefs.
It's kind of funny that you mentioned that, because some of my worst interactions with people are the very heavy all spanking, all corporal punishment is abuse, and my position in specific is we don't spank our kid. Number one, we don't even have to at this point. He's like so ridiculously well behaved. But I also don't take it entirely off the table, because I say, all right, well, if there's a situation where it's like they keep touching at the stove, like, will I smack their hand versus any chance of him getting, his hand burnt? Yes, I would. Right. Because to me, I'm trying to just weigh it out. It's very consequentialist, I guess, in that sense. But I leave it at these kind of extremes. I don't like if somebody were to say like, yeah, my kid was drawing on the wall and so I spanked him. I'll be like, I don't think that you really needed to spank them for that. So I leave it at, when the alternative is actually more physically a potential, there's a potential for more physical harm for a particular behavior than the spanking. Then I would say, okay, perhaps, maybe it's warranted, and, maybe a parent doesn't have a better tool in their toolbox and that's the best one they've got. Well, I'd rather your child not get, run over by a car or something like that. So in that particular case, but going back, earlier, I've had two notable interactions with people. One, a long time ago, somebody was like, spanking, this study here proves that spanking, diminishes your child's personality or something like that. Well, I read the study. And I was like, yeah, there's some problems with this study. I'm like, and I think one of them was with how they defined some terms. They were more inclusive than I thought were appropriate. And so I came back and I was just like, yeah, I don't think that study's really saying that. And, here's some problems with the study. And man, they unloaded on me and they were like, you effing child abuser. And I was like, what? And I was like, I'm disagreeing on a paper that you provided. And clearly you haven't read it, or you just didn't want to hear any arguments. And then the other one, which was more substantial, somebody that I actually know personally has traveled through Jacksonville, stayed at my house. That person and I got into it, and they were like, it's all abuse. And I was trying to get them to understand, like, there is a lot of people in this country who grew up being spanked, and they dearly love their parents. And I'm like, I think you need to be more, they were much younger too. They were like 22 or something. But I was like, I think you need to be more mindful about how you're framing this, because you're going to turn a lot of people off before you've had a chance to have the conversation. And so then it kind of just got a little, I didn't do such a good job of keeping it de-escalated, and it just escalated. And I finally was like, look, I love my mama dearly. She spanked me a lot. Um, are you going to sit here and tell me that, you know, contrary to how I feel, that I was abused? Like, I don't feel like I was abused, and I'm a rational person that can think these things through. And they wouldn't say it. And I'm like, okay, so you're not willing to tell me that I was abused, but you want to keep claiming it's abuse. I'm like, I feel like you're dancing around it in a sense. You know, you want other people to kind of confirm it, and you're not willing to be bold and just say, look, you were abused, whether you believe it or not. And I'm, you know, so we ended up parting ways over that conversation specifically.
That's too bad, because I think there's a lot of discussions like that where people are on opposite ends of it, that there's actually some value could be had from having a productive conversation.
Right.
We can be honest about things, and we can say what we think in a Jordan Peterson type of sense, like your obligation to tell the truth and stuff, but not be an asshole, and,
Right.
and not do it in such a way that it fractures relationships, right? And I think
Right.
people get so married, I think, to this concept of changing everyone's mind. Like you and I were having a discussion here. It's like, I'm not talking to you because I want to change your mind, right? Like I
Right.
want to have a productive discussion where I understand you. I'm curious about your point of view. Maybe you could learn something from me, and we end up better for it at the
Yep.
end of it. And I think so few people do that nowadays. Everyone has a team, no matter what it is. Like
Mhm.
this issue, I've got to be on this team, and I'm going to convert the world. I even
Right.
hate that term, like conversion, like particularly to political sense. Like we need to
Yeah.
convert people to libertarianism. It's like, my God, that sounds insane, you know? And also, like, what the hell do you know? Like
Right.
we're out here acting like we have all of this shit figured out. And at the end of the day, we're no smarter than these other people that we're bumping into. But we sort of
Right.
act like we are, and we think that we are. And I just think people could adopt a different mode of being. I think we'd end up with, you know, more productive conversations, and more enriched, from coming into contact with each other, as opposed to what we see online, which is typically, like you said, it ends up, you know, if you're on the opposite side of an issue, it just turns into some, you know, throwing feces against the wall, and, you know,
Right.
disassociating from people. And I really hate to see that, man.
Yeah, it's a challenge, and I've, you know, and I'm not gonna sit here and pretend like I always get it right. I've sometimes caused some problems myself. I've, you know, I've earned a few blocks here and there where I look back and I'm like, yeah, I probably should have, you know, I could have handled that better. You know, so you know, it includes me as well, you know, in that kind of situation. So, you know,
Yeah, well, so at least you can admit that. You know, I think there's some people are lacking self-awareness entirely,
right.
and it's just it's really frustrating to see. So,
But I do think that you really make a good point when you're saying like, hey, we're so busy trying to convert people. That is generally not my goal. And I tell people, I'm like, when I'm having a conversation, I'm actually looking for something different. I'm looking for the aha moment. And the aha moment is, I learned this actually from my mom, not learn it from her, but learn it from interacting with my mom. I became a libertarian. My mom was a diehard evangelical Republican. And this was when Gary Johnson was running. And, you know, she didn't quite like, for libertarians, Gary Johnson was pretty weak sauce. For my mom, he was pretty dramatic, you know, because he had said something about like not, you know, he like, I won't smoke marijuana in the house, in the White House or something. And she flipped out. She was like, what? That, you know. And so when I noticed something, that when I would sometimes talk to her and the point really did get across, even if she didn't agree with me, she would say something like, well, that's a good point, or that's fair. Right. And so now I look for those. That's really what I'm trying to get from somebody, is just them to acknowledge that I made a good point. It doesn't even have to be like all of them, just like, okay, maybe I make 10 points and you only acknowledge one, or maybe you half acknowledge one. You know, any acknowledgement, I think is a win. And that's all that I'm looking for, because at the end of the day, the truth is we rarely ever convince somebody in a single conversation. It's usually multiple conversations. And so, how are we going to have multiple conversations? Well, number one, I can't be a jerk to you today, because if I'm a jerk to you, then maybe if it was going to take 10 conversations to get somewhere, I've ruined the other 9 already before we've even had them, right? And I want to be able to build on the last aha, like, oh, okay, that's a really good point. Okay, that was a good point, you know. And if we can build upon those, then perhaps we can get somewhere.
Yeah, I think that's 100% right. And I wish everyone would reframe their conversations as a joint exercise where you and your discussion partner are searching for two things: what's true and what's good. If we
Right.
could just distill it down to that and believe that the other party is acting in good faith, and you just have a discussion, maybe have some curiosity about the other position instead of trying
Right.
to argue your position to get concessions and see it my way. I like this. I love it when I bump into somebody and they see things 180 degrees polar opposite from me. And I'm always like, that's interesting. Tell me more. Like, I want to
Right.
know more about how you're seeing things. I've learned, I think, the most from doing that. When we do that, I think we sort of get out of this ossified, sort of structured way of thinking and this like belief that we have it right and we got everything straight. And you're open to maybe updating your beliefs a little bit. I think people
Mhm.
don't do that quite enough. Like, we should be, I mean, obviously on the big things, I'm not saying wildly swing every single day like you're Matt Van Swole going from, you know, Democrat to hardcore MAGA overnight or whatever.
Right.
But the micro adjustments, because I think there's
Yeah.
so much nuance in the world. There's so much data out there in the world. There's so much suspect data out there in the world. Like you mentioned, there's shitty studies. There's people straight up lying out there. There's
Right.
psychological operations. There's misinformation operations, and like trying to even understand what's accurate and what's true and what's going on in the world. That's like a difficult thing. And if we're not constantly doing these micro course corrections, we're going to end up completely off the map.
Right. And the other thing I think people would, and again, everything that I say, any criticism I make of other people, of, whatever, they always apply to me. So let me just say that up front. But I think the other thing that we tend to forget is that you can acknowledge somebody's point, and it doesn't necessarily have to like crumble your entire view of an issue, even if like I think your issue is wrong. So like I'm anti-war, and if somebody is trying to make a point about why we should be going to war with Iran, and they make a decent point, I can acknowledge that and then recognize that, again, the topic is, there's still nuance in this topic. There are still other elements that, that are part of this conversation. So acknowledging a particular point doesn't necessarily mean that all of a sudden my whole position is destroyed. I mean, perhaps in some cases, if it's a particularly foundational or fundamental point, then perhaps. But there are actually many cases where you could just be like, yeah, that's a good point, but I think it's like way up here, and you still got these fundamental issues that need to be handled. So yeah, you got a good point, but does it really change my position?
Yeah, totally. So why are you in politics is my question. I see that you're very heavily involved in it. And I obviously I comment on politics, but I think
Mhm.
like I'm more of a philosopher. I'm more interested in talking about uh, principles.
Mhm.
And politics is the easiest way, I think, to sort of point out principles if you
Right.
comment on it. So talk me through like how you became a libertarian and why are you sort of in that political space now?
I have always enjoyed the arena of debate. I I like the idea, or maybe the arena of ideas.
Mhm.
And when I was younger in high school, I actually had a paper. I was evangelical conservative at that time, and Republican as well. And so I had a paper called Reality News that I typed up on my like dot matrix printer, and I would print it out and take it to school and pass it around. And all I did, I literally did what I kind of do now in a sense, but only in writing. I would go and read the paper, find an article that was interesting, and then just comment on it based on whatever was in the article. That was it. I didn't, because at that time there was no internet, and so searching things out it took a lot more time. So I would just give my opinion based on whatever, I kind of basically took it at face value and said, here's my opinion based on that. And I've always enjoyed just debate, challenging ideas, thinking things through. Early on, it was more of the, I'm gonna stomp on you, and it was more like the Ben Shapiro going to the college students, right? That it was that way. Now I think I've kind of moved into more of a, I guess maybe Charlie Kirk type, where you're prepared to do a debate, but at the same time you also are prepared to, be graceful with somebody and not try to, like I'm gonna crush them now, like that's not, even if I'm smarter than they are and I know more, that's not my goal here, right? So I've kind of, but that was my goal initially,
More
was
like
like
matching energy, I'm guessing, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
'cause
yeah, yeah,
I
absolutely.
think the difference between a Ben Shapiro or a Steven Crowder and a Charlie Kirk, because I think Charlie matched energy better.
Yes.
If you came at him both guns blazing, he'd fire back at you. If you came at him a little bit more humility and more reasonable, you'd get that back in return. There's a little bit more of a mirror.
Yes. And so why I chose politics, I don't really know. I've just always found it interesting. Perhaps because politics, culture, those kind of things, there's that overlap. They also have all these different avenues of information that can go into the conversation, right? So like we can talk about something and we say, okay, well, there's the legal element of it. Okay, what's the law say? Why does the law say that? What precedent is the law building off of? Then we can talk about more like, say, a philosophical, like, okay, philosophically speaking, if we break this down, how does this look? We can also look at the social dynamic of it. Okay, all right, how is society operated? Why would an idea work in today that may not work 1,000 years ago? Or why would an idea, say 1,000 years ago, might perhaps work then that sounds crazy and ridiculous today, right? And what is the distinction there? And then we can look at like what is the meaning of words, and I don't mean to get into an academic version of it so much. It's just to say like the conversation. You might have seen the whole, I call it the Trevor Gate, the guy that came out and said, yeah, he was a Christian guy. And he's like, my wife was promiscuous. I was not.
Oh,
We're married.
yeah.
That one that just blew up all over the internet. Right. And one of the things that I really took exception to with Michael Knowles, who I feel should know better because I know he's not a stupid person. He came out and he was like, wow, this guy called his wife a whore. And I was like, okay, you know better, because whore and promiscuous, they kind of can be synonyms, but the way in which they're being used, they're not really synonyms. When somebody says whore, they are trying to tear somebody down. They're trying to attack their character. When somebody says promiscuous, they might be saying the same thing in terms of the behavior, but they're trying to do it in a more neutral way and not necessarily tear the person down. And so I kind of took exception to it. I was like, no, in this particular case, the word choice here really does matter a lot. And I think you're smart enough to know better. And even if you were fooled, by a poor word choice, you could have surely seen how everybody else, like half the internet, was using it and said, I shouldn't use it this way. Or I should if I believe the way they are. But I feel like he was saying it, but then trying to justify it in a different, in a more intellectual way, whereas everybody else was just trying to dogpile on her or him, I mean. So, so I like all these elements that go into it, into having these conversations and saying like, all right, what am I missing out of this conversation? What could affect my position here? What might make me really rethink this? And I've had some things where and it's funny because I've had things where I've literally changed my position completely. Like I used to be very pro-war, right? But now I'm very anti-war. I've had other things where my position has moved maybe a little bit based on, learning new information. And then yet other things where my position actually didn't change, but the reasoning behind it absolutely changed dramatically, So, and that comes through all this different information that you might get, in different areas. So that's kind of a background of like how I got into it. And I just have always been interested. And I think I just naturally am inclined to debate ideas.
Got it. I'm that way too. Like I'm into all of that, not necessarily political, but scientifically and everything else. And so I totally get that inclination to sort of, it's kind of like verbal jousting, but it's also, I think, challenging your own ideas, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. If I put this
Right.
forward in the arena, where am I solid? Where am I weak? You sort of understand and refine that thinking, and it sort of improves over time. So I totally get that inclination. So are you into voting then? Like, are you one of these people that like participates in the electoral process, thinks that it's a vehicle for change? Like, how do you conceptualize that?
So and I think this is where we'll definitely disagree based on if I remember some of your posts correctly. I do not believe that we are necessarily past the I saw somebody posted there. They say you're not going to vote your way out of this.
Mm.
And my position is it's possible, but not probable. And so I think the infrastructure is still there. I don't think it's probable because voters are too superficial in how they approach the voting process. But I still keep it as possible. And the reason I haven't given up on it is because for me, I say the time when we give up on voting, the next step is taking up arms. I don't really see a big in between. And
I think you're right.
And because I don't like violence, and I tell people, I'm like, I don't like violence, but I'm not afraid of it. I've got way too much of a history with violence. I promise you, I'm not afraid of it. Not all 5'3" of me and 120 pounds, but I don't like it, and I want to stay away from it as much as I possibly can. And so I will wait until the absolute last moment. And I think that because I hold this possible, even though it's not probable, there's still hope. A glimmer, not much. It's very tiny. It's like a little speck in the sky, very far away, right? And you're like, I think I could see that star. Yes. Okay, it's there. That's kind of where I am. So
Got it. And to me, no offense, that seems delusional, right?
Sure.
Because I think that we've got anyone who could do math understands that the dollar's dead, right? Like there's absolutely no way that the dollar is going to continue. It's going to collapse. They'll probably replace it with a central bank digital currency. So that piece, from fiscal standpoint, America's doomed. Like economically, it's going to be really, really bad. It's going to be really, really painful. So that's done. And we've never seen liberty go in reverse, right?
Right.
Like, whoa, we started with like this incredible experiment in the smallest government possible, and it's turned in 250 years later, it's turned into the largest, most tyrannical, most evil government that we've seen in the entire world history. And so I'm like, hey, man, I'm an empiricist. I'm seeing this only going one direction. And even I think Donald Trump's presidency should have, in my view, should have put that final nail in anyone's coffin who was thinking that there was any sort of reverse mechanism to this. Because it was like, think of the fanfare. It was Elon, it was Doge. We're going to bring in Ron Paul. We're going to like all this bullshit. And they not only couldn't cut a single penny from the budget, but they exploded it. Spending is through the roof. Now we're talking about, $1.5 trillion for the military budget next year. We're in endless war. Like, bro, this only goes one direction. And so, no shade to the people that are still holding out, but
I try not to be too delusional about it and say like, yeah, we'll totally vote, and things are going to change. What I do hope though, is that one of two things happens. Either there is such a and I don't hope for it per se. I'm kind of balance my words here a little bit. One of two things I think is going to be necessary. Things get so bad that people rise up and pretty much physically toss out their leaders, and they vote in all brand new ones, right? They bring in all not one president. And this is one of the reasons why right after, like, I was not on board with the idea that Donald Trump has changed and he's going to come in, his second term is going to be better. And the reason for that was, one, I didn't believe him because based on his first term.
I saw his first term.
Right.
I've seen this movie before.
Right. Like his first term, okay, maybe we'll see what happens. Second term, I was like, nope, based on the first term, I don't expect anything. But the bigger reason was I didn't see a movement like we did with Trump for Congress. And in as much as our system is really, really broken, there is still some level of functionality to it. And it does require Congress. So like, for instance, Congress could, if they wanted to, end the war in Iran. They have the power to do that, but they're unwilling to do it. And the largest reason for that, probably the entire reason, is because the people are allowing them, right? Everybody who has power to impose upon somebody else who's not doing what they're supposed to be doing, they're neglecting their duty, right? So for me, I looked and I said, Congress hasn't switched over. I don't expect any change because, you've got the power of the purse and the House of Representatives. You've got, the Republicans now have they have the Senate and the House. But at the same time, when you look back in history, it really just seems to ping pong back and forth. The Democrats will squawk about something that the Republicans are doing, then they get into power, and what do? They basically do nothing with what they were complaining about. Republicans do the same thing. We saw that one of the most recent big things was the Affordable Health Care Act. Republicans talked a good game about it. They didn't come to the table with anything, nothing, not even like an idea. They literally had nothing. Then when they got power, what'd they do? Nothing. They didn't even make an effort, right? And so for me, I really looked at Congress and I said, when Congress changes, if and when, right, then I will be like, maybe something's going to happen, right? But I try not to be too delusional, but at the same time, not too quick to say we've got to jump to the other extreme and it's time to take up arms, right? And I don't know when that moment's going to be. Probably when
I do.
Probably when probably when people are really feeling like the third world, not like, oh, I don't like AOC and supposedly there's too many immigrants here. Like, I don't think it's that. I don't think it's gonna be that. I think it has to be real, actual pain before people will actually be motivated to do anything. And honestly, I don't look forward to that because, I don't want to see violence. But I think by the time we get to where we're actually going to change, violence will basically be the only answer.
Yeah, sadly, I agree. And my answer to this is like the time for this was a very long time ago. Right? People obviously don't like the idea of violence, but sometimes it's required. Like the entire
Right.
country was founded on a need, a necessity to sort of push back against tyranny, and they did. And unfortunately, they set up new tyranny.
Right.
And you talk about Jefferson's famous quote about the tree of liberty, man, needs to be watered like frequently.
Right.
This has to happen. That's just the way it has to be in that setup. And it's never been watered, like hardly at all. And so we're long overdue. And I think what's happened is sort of like the government takes these steps, and it has since the beginning. So like we set up this sort of quote unquote constitutional government, and with all these rules on government, and then government crosses the line, right? And then sees if people squawk, and if people don't squawk, they cross another line. They cross another,
Right.
And if they do squawk, they'll basically just pause for a little bit and they'll wait 2 years or whatever. Then they're going to encroach again. And I think this slow encroachment and have there's people having no line to which they will say this is the boundary, and we're going to take a Second Amendment type of action. It's they've taken too many steps to the point where we got complete digital surveillance of every movement, every word, every keystroke that is sent or received. They're tracking everything, and it's only expanding via Palantir. So we've got ourselves trapped in this cage. And I think you're right. Like the only thing that could potentially cause a massive change is going to be, a complete collapse. And if that happens, we're talking mass starvation, we're talking mass violence. It's going to be an ugly time. So I certainly am with you, and I don't relish in any of that. But I think that there's no getting out of paying the piper. I think we've been cruising on this sort of, the petrodollar thing where we get to export our inflation, we get to live beyond our means and live off this debt that we've been able to, the politicians have been able to accumulate. And that bill eventually comes due. And I think that we're not too far off. If you paid attention, I know you have, how much money is being spent on the wars and just the federal budget overall, and the inflation going through the roof. Like we're at that last stage where there's not really much recourse other than, collapse and violence. And that's a scary thing for somebody who's got kids,
It is. And the thing that I look at, and this is kind of why I take the position, because I look at it and I say, look, there is possible, but not probable. And then the only other option is violence. If I'm not willing to advocate violence, then for me, that means I just need to keep advocating the other one until violence happens, and then we sort it out, basically, and then just hope that maybe it lasts long enough that I don't see it, maybe even my son doesn't see it. I that's the best. And in the meantime, just do my best. I'm not a prepper per se, but do my best to prepare the family and keep us, make sure that we have good neighbors that we feel confident are, would be there in a time of need, and that we're in whatever way we can be prepared for, an entire collapse. But a lot of it just is because I'm not willing to advocate violence. I think if we get to that point, it just needs to happen, right? No advocate, because what ends up happening is you would advocate for, like, let's say somebody says, well, you know what, we're beyond saving, and the only way we're going to right this ship and not make it any worse is to just do the violence. Okay, well, that means you have to advocate for it, and we still have a system enough to squash that, right? And so I'm not, and I'm like, I don't like violence. I don't think it would work to try to advocate for it. So I think it literally just has to happen. Just snaps, people start going berserk, and then, well,
but then
the
what
cards
though?
will fall
But I keep coming back to then what?
Right.
You know, it's like you're aware liberty is not real popular. Like
Right.
Americans really hate freedom because it comes with a dose of responsibility. They really don't like to have that other side of the coin. And so I'm wondering, like, okay, so let's say this happens. Let's play this out. Like, okay, there's violence. A bunch of people kill each other. A bunch of people starve. Now what? Are we just suddenly going to embrace liberty and we're going to be free markets and free people? It's like, no, whatever they build is probably going to be a lot worse than what we've got, man.
It could be. And the interesting thing is, if we look in history, people had somewhere to go in many cases. Right. I mean, maybe it might be difficult depending on which conflict you're talking about. Like if you're talking about like Rwanda, like people couldn't just, up in, the Houthis, or, the Tutsis, whichever side was getting slaughtered. I think it was the Tutsis. They couldn't just necessarily up and just leave and just like, all right, we're done with this place. Right. But like when the colonists were tired of Great Britain, they're like, well, we'll just go across the ocean. We'll just go over here. Right. And they did. And then we'll set up our new system, and then okay, now we're throwing you guys out because we don't like what you're doing, right? But they have something. They had somewhere to go. There's nowhere to go at this particular point because, to be honest with you, America was the place that people were supposed to be able to go, like at least for a while. Like, hey, you got tyranny over there, we don't. Well, we have maybe not quite the North Korea level tyranny, maybe not quite tyranny that you see in certain countries. But we have tyranny compared to what we started with. And so we're not a safe place anymore, but there's no more uninhabited lands, nothing significant at least. Maybe a tiny island here and there, but there's nothing really significant. So there's nowhere to, so I have no way of predicting how it would play out or exactly how you need to be prepared or what might come, what might replace whatever we have. To be honest with you, I would probably say, if it collapsed in violence, what we'd probably have is you might see something more like a country collapse in violence. And if it got really bad, other countries would come in and basically try to restore order at their authority. And so like if the US collapsed in violence, then we might see that, or they might just say, oh, let you kill you guys.
Which countries do you think would do that?
I don't know. Because a lot of it's going to depend on where they are, what the global situation is with them, right? But I would imagine the first thing that's probably going to happen is people are going to be like, all right, well, there's a lot of guns in America. We'll let them duke it out, and when the dust settles, then we'll see what happens and what maybe it's worth going over there and trying to restore order at that point, or maybe they'll just let us duke it out, and then there won't be so many of us, and we'll just basically start over with who knows what. But I don't know. But I don't think it'll be liberty, because everywhere I turn, people are shirking the idea of responsibility. Mm-hmm. Like I just did a show on the trial out in California over Meta, where the woman sued Meta and several other social media companies and saying, hey, you addicted me and it's all your fault. And basically the position I took in summary was, your parents did a poor job of raising you on two fronts. One, first and foremost, because I'm a dad, I do dad talk, Liberty Dad, all that good stuff. I can be very tough on dads. And I said, okay, from what we're hearing, dad was abusive. Mom left the situation, which she should have. And then you got your first YouTube account at the age of 6, and at the age of 9, you got your first Instagram account. I think it was Instagram, TikTok, one of those. I don't remember which one, but she got her first, account, and then she created multiple accounts on these different social medias so that she could like her own stuff and make herself feel better. And so I was like, why did you feel the need to go get your self-confidence from social media? well, looking at your family life, you didn't have a dad. I'm very big on the idea of dads. Their job is to instill confidence in their children. Your dad wasn't there. So first and foremost, he is negligent. And we as a society should be willing to say, let's shame that guy and let's shame any guy that has children and either doesn't raise them well or creates a hostile situation such that the wife needs to leave. Because the wife might have, I don't know the circumstances, and I said this on the show. I was like, maybe the mom did everything she could. She still had, basically a handicap. And people don't want to talk about it. People don't, and I showed video where multiple women were like, you can't blame moms. And I'm like, we need to start getting comfortable with saying, I failed at this. If my kid grows up and does something very horrible, I will say, I have failed as a father, period. End of story. Now, if he gets in a little bit of trouble, then we can maybe blame that on him and say, look, you've got some agency here and you've got some responsibility. But if he's way out there, I'm like, nope, I got to accept that one. And we're not willing to do that. Not with the most simplest thing, but, parenting, which you would think people would be like, yeah, that's your responsibility.
Yeah,
and then it just gets worse from there everywhere else. Nobody wants responsibility for anything. It's not my fault I can't get a job. It's not my fault that I this or that. And it's like, at some point, you have to realize you're the one holding the bag. You got to do something with it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there is definitely a delta that society is seeing between holding parents accountable. I think mothers and fathers are held to a completely different standard.
Yes.
Are you seeing that out there? Because I see it like every single day.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll tell you this. So I spent a lot of time in church, and I'm not bashing on the church folk. In fact, I'm actively searching right now just, for my own personal benefit. But I observed this a long time ago. There was a book called Why Men Hate Going to Church, and it basically talked about the feminization of the church. But one of the points that he made in there, he pointed out, and I didn't realize it until the book pointed it out. It said, go to church on Mother's Day. What do you see? Mothers are great. You give them this rose. They're awesome. Thank your mom. That's cool. I have no issue with that. Go to church on Father's Day. What are many churches saying? You need to be better husbands. You need to be better fathers. You need to be better men. Stop watching porn. And I'm like, no congratulations on the one day of the year that men are supposed to be celebrated. And that's the day that you say the same thing that you say every, any other Sunday. Like, for real? No, there is definitely a different standard. It's in our society, right? If I will get away with criticizing a dad long before I will a mom, unless she's a very disastrous mom, right? Like, if she's like smoking crack and beating her kids, and like, hitting them with an iron or something like that. If she's doing something crazy, I can criticize her. If she's just a run-of-the-mill bad mom, people could be like, come on, dude, seriously, don't say that about, she's trying really hard. But they don't say that about dads.
Nope.
And I say they shouldn't say it about either, right? Because that child needs people that are going to be responsible and recognize that you are literally shaping how their life will turn out, right? And like, if you want to say a single parent is trying their best and they had to leave a situation, I get it, and I won't criticize them for that. And that's why I gave the dad more of a difficult time, in a sense, on my show, because I was like, all right, you created this. But there are plenty of 2-parent homes where there's no abuse and the parents are just not that good. They hand the kid a tablet and they're like, all right, go play. I'm going to go and get on Facebook, or go and get on Twitter. Or I'm going to watch some TV or whatever. I'm going to hang out with my friends. They should be criticized. And it doesn't matter if they're a man or a woman.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you touched on something important, is there's been a literal demonization of men and fathers.
Mm-hmm.
You look at, number one, you mentioned there's like not really any role models. There just aren't a ton of great role models out there. And number two, the portrayals of dads, in the media, like TV, it's always like the Homer Simpson or the Family Guy thing. Like,
right.
Like, it's always this bumbling doofus that can do nothing right, and the wife is great, and she comes in and rescues him all the time. Like, that sort of paradigm is really pervasive throughout all of the narratives that people are watching on television. And you go to school now, and like everything, there's toxic masculinity and the feminization of boys, and like I think this is a real mistake that society is making, and I think the time that people are going to figure it out is exactly what you talked about. When society collapses, when it's time for violence, when it's time for masculinity, like that that evolved for a certain reason.
Right.
And that sort of feminization of society is going to yield some pretty nasty results. I think there's going to be a very quick pivot for society, like appreciating those masculine traits, the positive masculine traits of protect and provide, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, so I reject the phrase toxic masculinity, because I just say there are toxic behaviors. And we were talking about this before the show with the whole woke left, woke right. And I'm just like, look, there's a foundation of behavior or attitudes that they may be expressed differently depending on, whether you're male or female, or maybe whether you're, on the right or you're on the left, or you're a Democrat or you're a Republican or whatever, right? Like they might be expressed differently, but at the end of the day, there is a foundation, and that foundation needs to be addressed. And so for me, I just say, there are toxic behaviors, and a dad can screw up his children just as much as a mother, and they'll do it in different ways. But it's still toxic behavior. And I don't want to get bogged down with, toxic masculinity, especially when there's not really an equivalent for feminine behavior. We don't have nobody says toxic femininity, right? Like that's, I mean, maybe some people, but it's not really a thing comparative to toxic masculinity. And a lot of the, a lot of the toxic masculinity arguments, I'm not even convinced that those are necessarily bad behaviors, because many of the people that promote those same labels, they've tried to include everything that gets on their nerves, like any kind of preference that they don't like. Oh, a man is sitting on a subway with his legs spread. Well, that's a level of toxic masculinity because he's man spreading. And I'm like, for real? Like, I would like to deal with the men that are abusing women, or the men that are that are poorly raising their kids, and you're worried about how they're sitting on the subway. Like, no, and then you're lumping it all in together. And I'm like, this is not acceptable. This is not going to work. And so you're right. People aren't going. If things collapse, they're not going to like it, because you're going to have a lot of very toxic men who aren't afraid of violence that will go too far. And that's going to be a problem. Like if we have a revolution, it is not going to be, what's his name from that, the film, The Patriot?
Mel Gibson.
I was trying to think of the character's name, but Mel Gibson, yeah. Whatever role he played. You're not getting a bunch of those men. That's going to be the rare man that you get, right? Most of the men are going to be like the British guy who was like burning, people in the church and stuff like that are very vicious and will win at all cost, no matter what, right? That's the kind of man that you're going to get by lumping this all in together and running with this notion of toxic masculinity, rather than dealing with real, actual toxic behaviors that we can all actually agree on. And that's the weird thing, right? There's a lot of behaviors that would be considered toxic masculinity that I would say are just toxic behaviors that most people can agree upon. Well, why can't we rally around those and just deal with that? And then once we resolve those, then we can worry about microaggressions and manspreading and mansplaining and all the other things that you don't like, that, are annoying, whatever. We can address those once we deal with, I don't know, the violence, the abuse. It's crazy. It's wild. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't have an answer to any of that stuff. It's just something I've observed, and I can make a prediction about. We'll see if things collapse, and if there is a pivot back to a healthy appreciation for masculinity. I sure hope so, man. It's one of those issues that I think is underrated, underappreciated. So I want to move on, though, because you mentioned some stuff about church, and I know you're raised religious. Like, what was your arc around that? Because I had a little bit of very wild arc of being raised super Catholic and ended up Protestant for a while, atheist, and went through a horrible Reddit atheist phase, as I like to say.
Oh boy.
Yeah. And now I'm like, I've had these, really transformational psychedelic experiences that came at the end of a lot of therapy dealing with the abuse from my childhood
Mhm.
that have opened my eyes to a point where I'm like, oh, wow, there's something going on here. There's some spiritual realm here. I don't know exactly what it means or what I'm connecting with, but that's kind of been my arc. Like, what's your arc been?
So initially, I think early on, I was like exposed to religion, but there wasn't an it wasn't an active thing in our household. So like I know I went to some Catholic schools when I was in like elementary, um, and I don't know, I have no understanding as to why my parents. I My dad was raised Catholic, so maybe that had something to do with it. My mom, she was heavily abused, and when I say abused, I'm talking about things that people couldn't even imagine, like like her dad would come home drunk and pull her sister and her out of their bed by their hair, throw them down the stairs, stomp on their head.
Ugh.
Like I'm talking about just vicious, just horrible abuse, right? And she's always believed in God, and she felt like that helped her get through it. But she didn't necessarily live, according to Christian principles necessarily, or at least limited on a limited basis, right? So when I was around 14 or so, I met a girl at school that I really liked. I thought she was pretty, and she was a church going girl, and so I was like, oh, I'll go to church too, if teenage boy, right? Like I'll go wherever the girl is, and that kind of ignited something in my parents, and we started going, and we all ended up in becoming evangelical Protestants. So we started out in the more wild churches, the very
Tell me you're
speaking,
handling snakes.
not quite that level. But the speaking in tongues, running up and down the aisles, stuff like that, praying for people falling over, the very, and I say this in a generous sense, the very dramatic variant of evangelicalism. And then eventually we kind of ended up in some churches that were a little bit more tame, but they still had some of that element, but they were much tamer. And then somewhere around, I think after, I think I started becoming disillusioned with some of the ideas that we were promoting. So it was like people would testify about, hey, I went to the grocery store and I prayed for a parking spot and then a spot just opened up. And I started questioning, I was like, oh, this seems like, does God really care about you getting a parking spot? Like, this just seems a little crazy, right? And there were other stories like that, and I just started like, I don't know. I'm like, it feels like, we're asking God to intervene for the trivialist of things and then making a big hay of it. And we seem to have more evidence, if you will, that he intervened in these cases, but less evidence on more important things, more substantial stuff, right? People are still dying of cancer, stuff like, and I'm like, I don't know. I'm like, I just started questioning that. And I also became disillusioned. I feel like, and this is where I'll be a little critical of evangelical Christians, I feel like there's a strain of anti-intellectualism in there. And I don't mean that they have to, I don't mean that they have to all be like, challenging, Richard Dawkins, and, the Four Horsemen from back in the, the early 2000s. I'm not saying that, but like one of the things that I started thinking about, I was like, well, God could intervene physically, but some things weren't adding up. So like I made up kind of like this hypothetical. I said, imagine that, and I've heard stories just like this, but I made up a particular hypothetical. I said, imagine that you walk out in the street, you get hit by a car, you're in the hospital, the doctor comes out and he's like, hey, you're good, he's telling your family he's going to live, but I just want to tell you, if he had been turned this much, or if the car had hit him at just this angle, just this spot, he wouldn't be here right now. Right. So, be thankful. And so I started thinking like, well, people would say things like, well, the angels came and slowed the car down, and I was like, so God sends his angels to do a half-assed job on a regular basis? Like this just didn't really seem to make sense to me. So but I didn't want to just be like, oh, God doesn't intervene. Maybe there's something else going on. And so I told one guy, I said, what if instead of that, what if this scenario happens? What if I'm leaving my mom's house? I walk out, I'm getting ready to cross the street. My mom remembers something. She says, hey, don't forget to call me or do this or whatever. And then I stop, I turn around and I say, okay, I will. And then I walk into the street and then I get hit by a car. And that happens so fast. But her calling out to me changed the trajectory just enough. And so I was like, I thought this was pretty interesting because I was like, now we're moving away from God intervening at a half-ass level, stopping you, kind of, sort of pushing you just a little bit, and more like now his infinite wisdom said, all right, I can intervene, by saying this, and that will cause enough to save his life. And that seemed to be, to me, a more, I don't know how to describe it, but it seemed to me that it could be more rational, a more rational explanation for why did you still get hurt? Why did you still end up in the hospital? And when I presented that to people, they just didn't want to hear it. You would have thought that I said, God has no power. Like, that's how it was received. And I was like, I am not, all I'm doing is saying maybe we've understood how God is operating incorrectly. Maybe we've misunderstood it. Maybe we thought that he's physically intervening. Maybe he's intervening less physically, but still intervening in a different way using his infinite wisdom, right? And it just was so poorly received. And there were other instances. So I kind of slowly drifted out because I just was like, I felt like a lot of things weren't adding up. They weren't making sense. But at the same time, I still kind of I believe in God. So I kind of went into this deist phase. And I was like, well, I believe there's a God. I just don't think he intervenes. I don't think he intervenes in man's affairs. I think he basically set the ball rolling, and then that's what happens. And if there is any intervention, then perhaps it's more like my little story where it's not a physical intervention. It's just a casual reminder to somebody that causes this chain reaction that plays out in a certain way. Lately, though, so I mentioned Pastor Tubb, who is a libertarian, and he's run for office here in Jacksonville, who I met when I was the chair of the Libertarian Party. He's Protestant, and I can't remember exactly which denomination he falls under, but I had a lot of conversations with him. And then one of my neighbors is a Reformed pastor. And so I get to talk to my neighbor a lot more about religious stuff than I do Pastor Tubb, because we were always talking about libertarian stuff for the most part whenever we got together. So there wasn't a lot of religious talk. But what I've really found interesting, at least out of my neighbor, I don't know if this fits the whole Reformed movement, but he seems very willing to just have a conversation about anything, right? And if I present an idea, he's not like, no. I mean, unless it's like a really, like if I said, maybe God doesn't mind me, cheating on my wife, he would be like, no, absolutely not, right? But if it's something else, more like the experience that I had, years ago, he's willing to entertain that and talk about it, and even acknowledge if he doesn't know. He'd be like, yeah, I'll have to think about that one, right? And I can respect that. And so I'm like, I don't know, maybe there's a different variant of Christianity that I would feel more at home. So I'm kind of exploring, or as I like to tell people, I have an exploratory committee with God right now. And I don't really believe that Tubb and this other guy have come into my life by accident. And the other thing that this one really threw me off. My neighbor comes over and has cigars with me, and he'll drink, and so does Tubb. When I was younger, I didn't know any pastor ever. Both of them are pastors. I didn't know any pastor that would sit down and have a beer with you, that would sit down and have a smoke with you. Now, Pastor Tubb doesn't smoke. It's not his thing. But and I was just like, I found that really wild. And it's not like, oh, I need my vices. It was just so different. It caused me to kind of stop and say, well, there's something different here, because it's so dramatically different from what I experienced. So it's got my attention. It's willing, there are some things that like the pastor that I'm talking about, he's a Calvinist. And what's really interesting about that, the fact that he's a Calvinist, I'm not on board with some of the ideas so far, or I have some concerns or some things that, I got a long list of questions.
Is it like the determinism that bothers you? I think the Calvinists are like existential determinists.
So so this is an area where I'm not well versed. So I may speak out of turn and be ignorant, and I'm just going to acknowledge that right up front. So far from what I'm learning, they believe in something called total depravity, where sin is basically corrupted everything on the planet. Okay, I'm okay. Okay, cool. I get that. That's why we got kicked out of the Garden of Eden. I get it. Okay, and that's why a lot of the results of getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden, why we have those, right? Like, hey, you're going to be working in the with your hands in the soil, and you're going to have pains of childbirth, right? Like that was all sin because it was so, because it corrupted everything. So one of the problems that I have is he told me that um, that sin is so pervasive that people on their own are not going to come to God without God calling to them. And so I was like, I'm struggling with that one. And then the other half of that is, well, God calls you just at his discretion for whatever reason, like no rhyme or reason. And I was like, okay, so you only get to go to heaven if God calls you based on no reason whatsoever. And even if you just said, I actually want to believe in something, you can't, right? The other thing with this whole total depravity is I'm like, and I'm still trying to search this out. So again, bear with me if I speak out of ignorance. I'm like, if everything is corrupt, then how is it that the scriptures are not corrupt in any way? Because while you can say they were divinely inspired, they still were written by men, human people who were corrupt. The Bible itself was compiled by men who are still corrupt, right? Everything on earth is corrupt. That means the paper that came from trees is still corrupt in some way, right? So how is it that, how do we know that there's not a flaw, not in the scripture in itself, but so much in the tangible elements that I can see? Maybe somebody wrote, maybe when they translated it, the sin that corrupted the translation, right? So I'm struggling with that one. And then I think there was some other things, but that's basically kind of where I am. And the determinism is a little bit weird to me, the predeterminism. But I find that interesting because I'm reading a book called The Feminization of the American Culture, written by Ann Douglas. And she talks about way back in the early 19th century, when we had like the Industrial Revolution, men left the homes. And so prior to that, a lot of the most homes, they were their own little mini economies in a sense. And when the men went out and the economy became more public facing, if you will, going out to work, then things shifted dramatically, not only in the economy, but also in the home and in churches, because men were no longer available for some of the responsibilities that they once had. And so therefore these voids were filled by women and more passive men who were basically adopting their, they were kind of adopting Christianity in a sense to the new base, if you will, right? And so it's very fascinating because I'm like, oh wow, like I'm reading this. I don't really like to believe in coincidences so much, at least when there's a lot of them at the same time. So like I've run into two people now that have encouraged me to kind of reconsider. One of them is in line with some of my disagreements that I've had in the past. So he's willing to, have conversations that others wouldn't. He seems very well read, very intelligent, and I can very much appreciate that. And so there's just this dynamic of just all these things that keep happening. And then he's of this particular faith that was pretty dominant early on in America's history, that I look back and I say, if we want to talk about the feminization of American culture, the feminization of church that I believe exists, we can go back. And I think that's a good point for which we can see a massive change. And so and from my understanding, the Calvinists of the day, they were known for a very heavy intellectual rigor. Whether you agreed with them or not, they weren't just like, hey, I prayed for an onion and wow, an onion appeared on my table and that's that, right? Like they were more robust in how they were presenting. So I think that's kind of my arc. It's kind of all over the place. I probably look like that meme of the guy with the
with the
strings on the board.
yeah.
I probably look like that. I probably sound like that right about now. But that's because I'm still searching and kind of trying to figure things out and understand it and whatnot. So.
Ah, dude, no shade. That's actually really admirable because I think so few people are willing to do that exercise, right? Because it takes humility. You have to like break things down to base levels and question your assumptions and all
Right.
that. So I would ask you, have you ever considered anything beyond Christianity? Right? Like, have you ever been like, I'm actually wide open. Like, I think something's going on. I think a God exists. And I think you mentioned you had a deist phase. How far did you stray, or at all, beyond Christianity as a potential option?
Not very far, but I did marry a Catholic, so there's that. My wife is Catholic, and she is very devout. So she was born and raised Catholic, and she attends mass very regularly, like virtually every weekend. I go with her sometimes, just because, like, not all the time. I'm trying to level up. One of my personal beliefs is that, I don't like the idea of a man sitting at home while his wife and children go to church. I'm like, you should take your children to church if that's part of your family life. Like, even if you don't believe, you should at least take them. And because, again, I believe that men should lead, and that's part of leading in the spiritual element. Even if you don't believe, I think you should at least lead them, and at least be willing to have the conversations and understand what they believe. Because otherwise, I think you're kind of neglecting your family in a sense. It's kind of like not knowing who your kids' friends are, if you don't know because if we can tell people you should know your kids' friends, then you should probably know a little bit about your family's faith as well. Like, that seems to be a lot more important. So, I'm listening. I have a lot of beefs with the Catholic Church, many. So, in fact, me and the priest that we reached out to initially, we almost got in a fight because he declined. He declined to marry us. The priest that we talked to, and I can't remember why. It's been about 13 years, but I do remember he said, well, if you were Catholic, you would understand. And if there's one thing that you want, if you want to get under my skin very quickly, you could just be like, yeah, you're not part of our group, so therefore you're too dumb to understand it. Like, no, sir, I can understand things. Tell me, explain it to me. And if I don't understand, I can do this thing called ask you questions. Right? Like, I'm a capable guy. So that was really insulting. I also didn't like, this one really got me. My wife was previously divorced. I was previously divorced.
Boy, they don't like that, do they?
So so we both had to get our previous marriages
annulled.
I was going to say nullification, but annulled. Mine was a more rigorous process. And I'm trying to remember what it was about hers. Hers was, she went in, I think it was because they weren't married in the church, and the church said, oh, well, then you didn't have a real wedding. That's that. End of story for her. I got married in a Protestant church, where Protestants believe that you can get divorced, and it does happen sometimes, and the Catholics don't believe it. So I got in an argument. I had to go. I spoke with one of the judges that was going to be reviewing my case. And I told her this. And I said, look, this doesn't make any sense to me. My wife was like in and out in 5 minutes. Didn't cost her anything. I had to pay like $500. I had to send paperwork to friends to write that they filled out and send it back. And I don't know what was on it necessarily, but I know one of my friends called me up and he's like, dude, I got these papers. Are you sure you want me to fill this out? And I was like, yes, whatever. Just fill it out. I don't care. And I don't even think I even asked him what it was. I was just like, I don't even care what it says. Just fill it out. Be honest, whatever. And he did. Right. And I was like, I had to go through all of this. And because I got married in a church, and I said, the Catholic Church respected my marriage that came from the Protestant church, but you didn't respect the circumstances or the understanding of the marriage in full according to Protestant faith. It's like you guys half-assed it, right? You wanted to respect the marriage itself, but when the Protestants said, yeah, you can get divorced, you didn't want to respect that. You didn't want to respect the fact that they allowed me to get married with the knowledge that we would prefer you not to get divorced, but it does happen, right? So it's like you guys pick and choose. And she was like, yeah, you're right. That's a good point. And, that's something that the Catholic Church has been talking about. So I'm not too fond of the Catholic Church. When her mom asked me, if I was going to, or not, when her mom asked her if I was going to become Catholic, she was like, nope, not at all. Other faiths, I haven't really ventured out. I don't know. I guess I'm partial to the Christian faith because that's what I know. I didn't. And I haven't met anybody that has been like, hey, DL, maybe you could be a Muslim, or maybe you could be Jewish. You could convert to Judaism. not Jewish, but you could convert to Judaism, or maybe you could be a Latter-day Saint or whatever, right? Like nobody else has kind of reached out and said, why don't you explore this? So I didn't. So the
Cool.
Christians were the ones that kind of did.
That's fair enough. That's an honest answer. I think a lot of people underappreciate how much culture dictates religion. You know, like it's part of the old, the new atheist arguments, which is like, well, if you were born in India, you'd be a Hindu right now. It's like, yeah, probably. Like that's
Right.
kind of the way it works.
But even that's not guaranteed, right?
For
Because
sure.
my wife is from Indonesia and she's Catholic. Like Indonesia has the largest numerical population of Muslims on the planet of any country, right? It's like the percentage isn't as high as like the Middle Eastern countries, but it's like 88% or something, 85% or something like that. And there's like 2% are Catholics. And the first Indonesian that I met was Catholic. Go figure.
Yeah, it definitely is not, an ironclad law, but you get my point.
Right.
Like a lot of that stuff is,
absolutely.
and I think a lot of people do get kind of comfortable with certain thing when they're trying to conceptualize and think about something as big as God. I think sometimes having that comfort and that sort of mental model around it already, the structure kind of helps. So when you zoom out, and you're asking yourself that question generally, like, does a God exist, right? Regardless of which one or what the properties of the God are, like, what is your most convincing argument or reason to believe that such a thing as a God would exist or does exist?
When I look at the alternative to any religion, I'm not necessarily like evolution can't happen, right? But I'm like, the probability, and I've never tried to figure out what that probably, it just seems so tiny, even if you stretch it across billions of years. In fact, I think that even makes it more interesting. It just strikes me as unlikely, right? Like, which one's more likely? Was there a God that created the universe, or did this really long chain of events happen so perfectly so as to create all of this, and that's that. And I'm kind of the mindset, I'm kind of a heretic. So in that sense, I don't believe in a literal 6-day creation necessarily. And I don't think that it's necessarily required for any faith. Like, I've never heard of any faith that says, like, if you don't believe in a 6-day creation, you can't possibly be a Christian. People just do the normal, like, you're not a real Christian if you don't believe this.
It's almost like libertarians.
Right. And so I look at it and I say, well, perhaps there's some possibility that it's a combination of both. Maybe God does exist, created the world, let it get set into motion, but the writers at the time, the way they wrote about it was to the best of their understanding. Imagine if I had a vision of 100 years from now, or maybe even longer than that. Maybe I had a vision of 1,000 years from now. I'm probably going to have trouble writing about it because there's going to be things that just I don't even know how to mentally describe correctly, right? And so I imagine the same happens in reverse. So if you hear about something that's happened thousands and thousands of years ago, or you just happen to see it in a lot of it, especially when you're talking like something as significant as literally the creation of everything. It's one thing to be like, oh, if I saw a wild Western movie, then I might be able to put that into words relatively easily, because there's still going to be some common components. There's going to be humans, there's going to be guns, there's going to be clothes. So a lot of those things are, they're just going to look different, but they're going to be basically pretty similar in some ways to what we have now, right? There's going to be some shared reality that still exists. But if you're going back to the time of creation, there's really no shared reality. So you're going to describe it in the best way that you can. So for me, I look at it and say, I don't necessarily believe that you have to go one or the other. And so I look at it and I say, between the two, I'm not willing to go full on either one. And so that kind of puts me in the middle, and it kind of forces me to say, I believe there's a God. Also, I want to believe there is one, right? I just want to, because I want to believe that when we die, that's not the end of it. like
Mm.
there's something else to move on to. So that's kind of why. And maybe that's more of the maybe that's more fundamental for me. Maybe it's more that I really want to, and that I'm trying to wrap my mind around everything else, and then trying to figure it out to kind of like satisfy what I want to believe. I don't know.
That's honest, man. And I think we all kind of like this idea of continuing on, right? No matter what that looks like, is that this idea that we would not exist. Kind of terrifying to some people. I don't think it's as bad for me because I really thought about this sort of heuristic, which is, okay, how do I feel about the billions of years before I was born? Like, do I have anxiety about that? It's like, what was my experience then? It was like, I didn't have an experience. Like it was fine. Like I was totally okay with those billions of years. And after I die, if it's the same thing, I'm like, yeah, I'm kind of cool with that too. That wasn't so bad, like that's kind of
Right.
how I conceptualize it. But I definitely kind of hope that things continue. Like I don't want to just like have this be it. And like,
Right.
everything I'm doing right now is all the mistakes, all the positives, everything is just, well, that's me. And, throw me in the ground and it's over. Like that kind of sucks as an idea. So I
Right.
get the idea, the impulse to be like, yeah, I want to have something more, and maybe I'm grabbing onto that with the psychedelics. Like I've had these experiences, and you get this sense that there is a returning home. Like there's this sense that you go back to somewhere where you originated from, and it feels nice in the moment. Have you ever done psychedelics before? You ever had any experience with that?
You familiar with Porkfest?
Oh yeah, yeah.
So I tried shrooms up there, a light dose,
Mm.
so nothing dramatic because I was like, I don't really know what I'm getting myself into.
Smart
And
move, by the way.
the interesting thing about psychedelics is when I was growing up, I had friends. They were the Pink Floyd guys, the Parrot Head type
Yeah, yeah.
folks, and they were all they loved acid. And they were like, dude, you gotta try acid. But they were very terrible salespeople because they would be like, dude, you need to try acid. They would say like it's really great, and then they would like everything after that was downhill because they'd be like, make sure you don't do it with somebody, make sure you do it with somebody you trust. Because if you have a bad trip, like we knew this one guy, he saw his mom's face melt off and he freaked out. And I was like, you just screwed this up. Like, and nobody ever tells me good stories. Nobody's ever been like, dude, there I was tripping out and I saw an angel and she came to me and she told me that, like, nobody do. It's weird. I don't understand it. They always would say, they would give you the actual story when it's negative, and there seems to be no story to tell you when it's positive. They just say, yeah, I had a good trip. Okay, but what about it? What made it good? Why? And so when it comes to, and I know that LSD is not the same as psilocybin, but
It
for
is
me,
not.
psychedelic is psychedelic. And I'm like, okay, so I'm gonna approach it with the hesitation that I have with LSD, right? That like I won't try LSD because of those stories. So I'm a little hesitant to try, anything significant when it came to shrooms. But I tried it, and it was kind of like it was like a hardcore high from marijuana, but without some elements. And I'm not sure that I could describe it so well. But it was like there are some elements, and they were stronger, and then there were other elements that weren't there. And so, but I don't know that I could describe it so well.
Well, that's the
But I did that.
problem. That's a problem. Actually, it's a component of a psychedelic experience. It's called the ineffability. It's
Mhm.
like you have an utter inability to put the experience into words. And that's a frustrating component of it. Like you can, like you said, describe a bad trip. Like you can talk about
Right.
the ways in which it goes wrong. But when you start talking about trying to put a container around what that experience actually was like, it's like I watched Sam Harris like talk for 2 hours about he did a massive dose of mushrooms, and like he's like incredibly verbally fluent, and he was having trouble.
Mm.
It's a very difficult thing to talk about. It sounds like you had a pretty entry level dose. I'd be guessing like a 2 gram, maybe
Yeah,
something
I think
pretty
yeah, I
small.
think it was 2.5 maybe. I think
Sounds
I
about right.
don't remember exactly, but it was somewhere around there. I believe. I took it easy because I was like, I don't know what I'm getting into, and I didn't want to be the guy that flips out and goes bananas.
Especially at Porkfest with all the other
right.
libertarians that are already fighting you anyway.
Well,
So
that, and I've kind of got a podcast and all that, and I didn't want to make my name for myself. Like, oh yeah, Liberty Dad, the guy that can't handle his mushrooms.
yeah, dude. Nobody can handle the mushrooms. I'm just gonna be straight with you. Like if you get at a high enough dose, like you're kind of gone. And then but the problem
Right.
is that I think you have to have sufficient dose to have that mystical experience. That's what like the Johns Hopkins research always talks about. Like you have all these massive benefits, like the curing of depression, smoking cessation, doesn't matter what it is, like these major benefits,
Right.
reduction of end of life anxiety for cancer patients, people with terminal cancer. And it appears to be tied to the mystical experience. It's not the drug itself. It's not the psilocybin itself that's doing it. It's having the experience. And
Right.
so having that high dose, 5, 6, 7 grams, it seems to be like necessary. And it's a completely different landscape of mind than at a 2 gram, 3 gram dose. Like there definitely is a tipping point where you have this sort of like head-on collision with the transcendent. And that's the thing that anyone who's had it, like within the sound of my voice, is going to be like, yep, I've been there, know what that's like. Couldn't describe it, for shit, but it's definitely a real thing. And so I'm always curious, like if people have religious convictions, if they've actually had that, because I'm of the belief that every religion, major religion that's out there, sort of came from psychedelics or meditation, like one of the two. Because I'm not sure if you're aware, but like long-term meditators can get into an identical headspace as taking massive doses of psychedelics. So I think there's plenty of evidence to indicate that like this is kind of like the core of a spiritual experience. And I think most of these religions just kind of popped up trying to sort of make sense of it. And I think they're all sort of failing. They're all falling short kind of in their, their own ways. But I think we're all kind of aiming for the same thing.
Yeah. And the other thing is, I'm busy these days. So I'm, I work, I podcast, I have a son. And so for me, like I stopped drinking the next day after last Easter, just because alcohol just doesn't really.
Good for you.
It wasn't giving me a good experience, right? And I mean, like, I might drink 1 glass of wine, and maybe I feel good the next day, or maybe I'll drink 3 glasses of wine, just casually drinking, like not like slamming them or anything, and I feel good the next day. Or sometimes I would drink 1 glass of wine and I would feel like terrible the next day, and I was like, what gives? Like, this isn't working for me. I don't like the inconsistency of it. And so I will take gummies, like in the evening or something like that to kind of relax. And I much prefer that because, I don't wake up and feel like garbage the next day. Cause I can't afford it. I cannot afford to be even, pretend hungover just because my body reacted poorly to a single glass of wine. I cannot afford that because I got things to do. The other thing is, I always take like I don't want to say maybe a microdose, but like maybe a mini dose. So I never get like really wasted, because as the man of the house, I need to always be prepared.
Yes.
What if somebody breaks in? I can't be stoned out of my mind and incapable of fending off somebody. I can't, if there's a fire, I need to be capable of, getting the family out. So I always keep it at a relatively, a pretty low dose. With shrooms, though, I think to get a meaningful experience, it's got to be at least the 2.5, unless you're doing the microdosing, and that would be an entirely different purpose. But like, to get the more spiritual experience requires a dosage that's going to put me out for too long when I need to not be out, and when I mean out, I mean just like incapable of properly responding in the way that I feel that I need to, if something comes up, So that's one of the reasons is like, I go to Porkfest like maybe every couple of years at best. So, it's like there's no chance for it but now that I've done it once, if I were to go to Porkfest, which I would be by myself, and then of course I have like, however many days I'm there, it's fine. I might be willing to try it again, especially now that I've had at least that first initial experience. And so I'm like, oh, okay, I kind of have an idea what to expect. Yeah. I know that I have a sensitive stomach, so that was a little rough initially. That got me, and I had a little bit of initial anxiety. Just because I have a sensitive stomach, and it kind of hit hard in the stomach, and I was like, "Rrr," but then it leveled off and I was chill. So that was good. So I don't know, maybe in the future I'll give it a shot again, but very limited opportunities to try it.
Yeah, that's smart and that's responsible. And I would like just to say, everyone, I'm not encouraging people to do this, but if you do go down that road, make sure you are responsible, you are safe. you are sequestered away, because it will take you a minimum of 6 to 8 hours to get back to baseline. That's not a place where you need to be in a situation where you need to respond. Like you said, there's some sort of responsible way that you need to respond in some way. You have to be completely sequestered, and like, I'm okay being offline for this period of time, and you're around people that you trust and people that will care for you if you have a difficult experience and all those things. So I always like to put those caveats out there for people, because I think that sometimes people get very irresponsible with it. Like, I'm gonna go slam 5 grams, go to a concert. Like, no, stop it, people. Like, it's very serious stuff. I take it incredibly seriously. I think it's a spiritual practice. It's not something that is to be taken flippantly. No shade to people that use it, quote unquote, recreationally, but I don't think that's the primary purpose for it. I think you can get yourself into serious trouble if you don't treat it with the respect it deserves. So I will end it with there, man. We're at time. But man, I really want to thank you for pulling up today. I had a great chat. It was great getting to know you, man. And why don't you tell everyone where they can find you online?
So I stream Monday through Friday, 7:30 a.m. Eastern, libertydad.com. You can find that's like the website that I have. But if you want, that's not live. That's just the regular podcast website. But if you want to find me, you can go to youtube.libertydad.com. You can go to I think facebook.libertydad.com and x.libertydad.com if you want to find me on the social medias. YouTube.libertydad.com is probably going to be the most reliable. Go there, check me out. I've got like some 700 podcasts. So I talk about, I generally stay away from foreign policy. It's not my wheelhouse, but I love domestic policy. So I talk a lot about domestic policy, culture. My last episode, like I said earlier, was talking about the trial with the woman who sued the social media companies for her addiction and all the things that happened to her. I had to, and I was pretty straightforward on what I believe there. But other than that, I interview candidates. I love interviewing candidates. That's kind of fun. So I primarily interview libertarian candidates, but I open it up to Republicans and Democrats if they are willing to come on the show. And then, as always, I love having dads on to talk about what's important to them. Even if I don't agree with you, that's the one time that I will not debate with somebody. I'll just be like, oh, that's very interesting. And, we just have a conversation because I want to raise dad voices. And I think that dads are underappreciated, like you said, and anything I can do to give them a bump, that's what I try.
Awesome. Everybody go check out his work, man. I really love seeing you come across my Twitter feed. It's been great chatting with you, man. We'll talk later.
Yes, sir.
Bye.
Bye-bye.